Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Angular Unplugged show. We're very excited to have Wormald today on our show. He works on the Angular core team. All of you already know. So I actually call him as the prince of the observable world because there are already two contestants for the king. Those are Ben Lish and Andre Stahl, if you know them. So he's actually the prince. So yes, Mr. Prince, can you introduce yourself?
That's a good way to describe it, I guess. Yeah.
What?
You could call me that. Prince is fine.
Okay, cool. So here's Rob Wormald. Yes. So what are you doing, Rob?
What am I doing? So my job is I'm a developer advocate on the Angular team, which means I get to spend about 50% of my time writing code and doing engineering, and then the other half doing stuff like this. So talking to the community, going out to conferences, going to a lot of our customers, big companies who use Angular. And a big part of that is not just like telling the world about Angular, but kind of telling Angular about the world. So we go out to customers and they tell us, hey, this doesn't work in our environment, or hey, there's this shiny new tool that we really want to try out, or whatever. So a big part of my job is feeding suggestions, comments, concerns, whatever, back to the Angular engineering team to kind of improve the product. So.
Okay, so there's one feature in Angular that I totally don't understand, right? I really don't understand, and that is observables. So what are we doing today for observables? Can you explain?
I think we're just going to run through, just to start with some basics of using observables in Angular, what they are, sort of what their point is, and then hopefully some kind of practical use cases and kind of get a feel for how to use them, not just by themselves, but in Angular, the framework, and where they're exposed in Angular and where you can kind of get a feel for where they exist.
Okay, cool, great. So I think let's get started with this thing. Hopefully if you can share your screen, and I'll give you a heads up.
Let me just pop this open.
Okay.
So let me know when you can see me.
Yeah, I can see your screen.
So this is just the basic quick start from our. This is the thing you go through if you're using the Angular tutorial on angular.io. That's available at our quick start, basically. So it's Angular quick start. You can play with that. Try to set up and go with. So basically, app's just a hello world, and we'll sort of expand it out and kind of see where we go from here.
So I think let's get started with maybe basic definition which you have for what is RX and what's the connection between RX and Angular 2.
Sure. So the keyword you use there, observable, is proposed specification for JavaScript. So in the same way that we finally got promises in ES6, observable is going through a similar process right now. So RxJS, which is the project that we use inside of Angular, includes an implementation of observable, just the simple type, and then includes a number of utilities and things that make them that much more powerful. So I get in trouble when I say this, but Lodash for observables, right, is what Rx is. And so we use Rx in Angular because it's right now the most performant and kind of the most to spec implementation that's out there. And so we're working really closely with the Rx team. Do that.
So in the future, before we start doing the coding stuff, so in the future, is there a plan to look out for other integrations of any functional programming library other than RxJS?
So I think that where we'd like to get to eventually is at some point in the future, hopefully there will be an observable natively in the browser, right? At that point, we would just leverage the native observable. And then, of course, projects like Rx would continue to exist, but rather than providing their own implementation of observable, they would just be and Lodash on top of that, right? And so Rx would become everything except observable, basically.
Perfect. Okay, cool. I think let's get started and see what we can do today.
Oh, that's my software update popping up. So cool. So I think you should just drive me because I think you have a good agenda here. So if you want to tell me what the first thing on your list was.
I think let's first look at how can we import observables, or how can we import RxJS into our project.
Sure. So the first thing you want to do, obviously, and I've already done it in here, you would do npm install RxJS. There's a few of them out there, but RxJS is the one you want. This will give you the latest, the same version that we use. Don't use Rx or ReactiveX or any of the other ones. RxJS is the one you want. If you're using Angular 2, you will have already installed this as part of your dependencies, so it'll be there already. And so the basic way you do this, the basic thing to start, you start with an observable. So we're just going to import from RxJS/observable. So RxJS here is the name of the package, right? And then we're importing from a file deeply in there. This exposes to us an observable type. And so again, this is just like promise, right? And then from there, if we wanted to create a new one, so we could say my observable here, and then we would go ahead and create a new observable. And so this is the absolute simplest definition of it, right? And this is a sort of totally inert observable, but this is the minimum amount of code you would need to if you wanted to create an observable.
Cool. Okay, and if we want to take this to a Angular component, if we can, do the same thing with an Angular component.
So, inside of an Angular component, so I'll just bring that back in. We'll go look at one of our components here. And so I could do exactly the same thing in here, right? I'll just do import observable from RxJS observable. And then if I wanted to make this available on my thing, so what I would actually do is expose the properties. So we could say like my stuff. And what we see here is this is an observable, it's the type, and then this observable here has its own type. Here. So I'm going to put any just for the moment, so we don't have to type it out. And so the shorthand of this would be just like new observable here, right?
Yeah.
So that's again the most basic usage of it, right? But this is the syntax you want. So it's what the name of the property is, the type of thing the observable will deliver, and then creating an instance of the observable itself.
Okay, cool. So I think the first question I have in mind is, so replacing the any thing, the type. So can I have any kind of type, or can I just have generic types, or?
So this little syntax here, if you haven't seen this much, and you'll come across this in TypeScript. This is a TypeScript feature. And this, because an observable is the thing that gives you values, right? What we're saying is this is an observable that delivers you this thing, right? And what I'm saying here is right now this could be any type of observable. I can change this to a number, or a string.
I can change this to array of string.
I could say an array of strings, or if I had a custom interface like my thingy, right? I could use that as well. So effectively, any type you could use anywhere in JavaScript. The same thing applies to that.
Okay, cool.
And what's nice about it, when it delivers, you get type checking with that. So if I set this to let's do this. So this is like my thingy has a name with a type string. And then if I were to subscribe to this, my observable here, bring out my constructor, if I can type. I don't know why you make me live code and not. It's always really hard.
That's fine.
My stuff. If I were to subscribe to this, right, it will now tell me that this is a.
Oh, cool. It's giving me the information of the interface, right?
Right. It'll tell me exactly what it is that this observable is going to deliver to me, basically.
Okay, perfect. Sounds good. Okay, one quick question I think I forgot on the import piece. When we're importing observables from RxJS/observables, I have also seen people doing import RxJS, just that.
Yep.
That looks so weird to me. So do you know what that is?
Yeah. So this is something that we actually debated a lot when we were designing the way that Rx and Angular work together. And so the idea of this is that in some cases, and so the core of Angular, all we want is just observable, right? Not all utility stuff that goes along with it. So importing it this way will just give you the bare observable, right? With none of the sort of extra shiny functionality. So really all you get is observable and the ability to subscribe to that observable. The other way, as you said, the other way you see people do this, and if I just show you this, so I'll do like let o is a new observable. And when I do type completion on this, right, there's only a couple of things I can do. So I can subscribe to it, I can throw it, which is the same, and then I can lift it, which is how you create a new observable. So this is good when you really only want the bare minimum, right? And really you want to bring in as little code as possible in all applications, right? So that's why we do it this way. If you were to bring in Rx, if you were to bring in an observable from here, the first thing you get, let's get rid of that. First thing you get is, not just observable, but all of the utility stuff that comes with it. So there are special types of observables and promise observables and this, that, and the other. The other thing is that then our observable actually then gets populated with all the extra sort of functionality here. So now when I do type completion, I get, the 150 odd operators that come
all the functional operators that we have within the Rx.
That you introduce and all this stuff. And so this is like doing the RxJS/observable is the simplest way. Doing RxJS will give you everything. And the way that we actually recommend you do it in your own applications is to generally import observables with just a type. And then this other thing you can do, which is saying, like, I only want to get RxJS/add an operator of mapping, let's say, right? And so that allows me to pick and choose the specific utilities that I want, rather than bringing in the whole mess.
We'll get to the subject observables and others later in the end of the show, maybe. But how do we do that? It's the same way, right? We do RxJS/.
So there's an RxJS subject, right?
Yeah.
And the same thing applies. And again, all of those things are available from the regular RxJS package as well. So in here as well.
Perfect. Sounds great. So what can we do next?
I'm going to actually just leave that as Rx. So I'm going to be lazy on this talk and not repeatedly import these. So we're
sure. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So what next? So I think to start with, let's say maybe if we can create a service that has a observable that actually returns an observable to me, and maybe try to consume that service from our component.
So pretty good example of this, and I'm going to do it in the same file here. Actually, let's create a new file just to do this properly. So I'm going to create an app.service.ts. I'm going to import a couple of things. So I'm going to bring in the injectable annotation from Angular. This is just lets Angular know that this is a service, something we want to inject. That comes from core. And I'm going to go ahead and import observable from RxJS here as well. I'm going to export a class of, let's call this the user service, and add the injectable annotation. And again, this doesn't do anything other than just tell Angular, hey, this is a service I might want to use. And then there's a couple ways to do this. I'm going to sort of cheat a little bit here, but what I'm going to do first is bring in the service from /app.service. Yeah. So it's a service, right? So we want to be sure we add it to our providers array. This makes it available for Angular to do dependency injection with. And then I can grab that. We'll go back to our components. We'll bring that in here. And we'll do basic Angular DI. So this will be our user service. We'll get injected here. There. I'm also going to assign this as public. So it's going to automatically assign that to the component, which means in some other method, get stuff, I have access to it on this, right? My user service is there. So there's a couple of ways you can think about this, I think. And sort of the traditional one that everybody's kind of used to, and we'll show you that first. So like if our user service is going to, it might get users from a back end or from Firebase or whatever, you would do something like this typically. You'd write a method, right? So get user. And then in here, I would do something like, let's return a new observable. And I'm going to do the hard way here. So I'm going to create a new observable that takes an observer object. And we'll cover this in just a second. And then what this allows me to do, why is that complaining? Yep, fine.
Any.
Explicit any, because that's going to be annoying because I'm lazy. We'll call it an any at the moment. Actually, let's do that right. Subscriber, I believe, is the interface for this. No, let's just leave it for the moment. So this is like a promise, right? Where a promise sort of, you create a promise, and then inside of that promise, you do some work. So what I'm going to do here is just do observer.next, and I'm going to have this emit like an array of users, right? So name is Rob, name is Sally, right? And so then if we go back to our component class here, we'll get our awesome type completion, hopefully. So if I bring in my user service, I can say get users, right? If I return this value, so I'm going to assign like user list here. If you're used to doing this promises, right, like this should feel fairly comfortable, right? So you have a user service. It's going to return to me an observable, and this is now an observable of whatever, right? And so I'm actually type it here. So if I go back to my service, just so we get nice type completion, I'm going to say this is an observable of, we'll call this an any array at the moment. And actually, we'll just leave it off for the moment. Come back and do types later. .ts, right? So what's interesting about this, right? So this is now an observable, but if I were to run this, nothing's going to happen. And this is the most important thing, I think, that if you're new to observables, you need to understand here is that this doesn't do anything. All I've done is created an observable. And so observables, unlike classes, are lazy, right? Like nothing's going to happen. Why is this? If you're using System.js, just as a point here, this little X mark text thing here. This is useful to know. I could change that in my config, but I'm gonna leave that as is right now.
You have to do the mappings if you're doing.
We're gonna have to do them anyway because it's not set up here. So let's do it so everybody can see how this. So don't worry too much about system.js here. But all I'm gonna say is the main file is rx.js, and now everything's hunky-dory, groovy. So if I go back to my app component here, right, and so I'm gonna log this out, this user list. Reload here until we see is now we actually have an observable. Right? We call the function, get an observable here. But again, nothing's happened, right? Nothing is actually done. All we've done is created one. And so if I want to get that value out, I have to subscribe to that observable. So I'm going to userlist.subscribe.
So can I think of this observable that I've got, can I think of it as a wrapper which has the data inside of it, and I need to unwrap that?
I think that's a reasonable way to say it. The only thing I would say is that it's a wrapper that will contain the data when you ask it to go get the data, right? Like that's the difference, is that promised observable exactly are wrappers for these values. But the observable, until you tell it I want the data, nothing happens, right? So nothing actually occurs until it happens. So if I'm just going to subscribe to this, and all this is say, hey observable, go do whatever I want you to do, right? Go do whatever work is inside of the observable and get me the data. So I can then subscribe to this, and this should be my list of users, right? And we'll console.log those users out. And hopefully what we'll see in the console now, make it bigger so you can see it, is it will then actually, so now I've got my 2 users coming through.
Okay, cool.
Now, one of the things, just while we're doing this, that I said this is the sort of traditional way that people do this, right? You have a method which calls a thing. The interesting thing about observables, because, again, they're lazy here, we could actually do this. And this may blow your mind a little bit, but I like blowing people's minds. So we could assign this to a property on our class instead. So rather than having a method, right, we're just going to do a property. And so then we go back to our components.
And then we can do a users service.user.subscribe. Just a guess.
Exactly right. And that way, to me, this actually makes more sense when I think about it, because it's like, it's the list of users that are on the service, right? I don't have to get them. And again, Angular won't do anything, Rx won't do anything until I say, give me the users. So it's really nice to be able to wire up, I think, services very quickly and very concisely, right? Without having to write a method for everything, right?
Yeah.
When I do stuff, I'll ask for it.
Yeah, and in fact, I think that's like more cleaner a component, because you don't have to worry how your service is actually setting up those observables, right?
Exactly right. It's just like any other, you could think of it just like an array at this point, right? Like it's just a property that exists on the service. The difference is that I'm going to get pushed a new version of it, right? And that's the major interesting thing here.
All right. So how about putting these on the templates? Can we?
Let's do that. So there's a couple ways that, again, you can do this. And so this is the sort of most basic way here, right? Again, I want to have a property for this. So I'm going to say this is a list of any's. And so the simplest thing is to just ask the user list, right? So you subscribe to it. And then I can say this.users is users. Why are you complaining here? Because that's
are we within the subscribe?
Let's do that. Should really not be lazy and go back and type that. So again, I'm getting a list of users out here, right? I'm just assigning to this.users. And then in my template, it's very simple to go in here and say, let's do an unordered list. Holy cow, I'm really not able to type today.
That's fine.
And do li, we'll do an ng4, let user of users. And we'll just go ahead and log out the user.name. Hey, luck. Yep, Robin's
cool. We have it running.
Hooray. Always good when the first thing we do actually works, so that's good.
Yeah. Okay, cool, great. And maybe are there any better ways of consuming that observable? Maybe do we always have to call the subscribe method, or are there better ways?
So because we have observables baked into Angular, we realized quite quickly that this is something that becomes sort of tedious to manage. So we have in Angular a very cool feature here called the async pipe. So what I'm going to say here is that instead of this being just a straight array, I'm going to make this an observable of any, right? And then I can do this dot user service. Oops, this dot users is user service dot users, right? And so I'm going to fix this in just a second here. But again, this dot users here is an observable, and then we're saying just assign the user property here to this. I think this is as observable list. Yes, great, cool. But at this point, then all I have to do to actually use it this way. So again, I've got my user's property, which is an observable, right? I just go to the end here and I add the asynchronous pipe. Async. And this tells Angular, hey, this is an observable. This works with promises too. So observable or promise you can use this way. And it will actually go ahead and automatically unwrap the value for you. And then Angular will, will pass it through to rendering. So if we go back to this, hopefully that's still working. Yes, it is.
Great.
So it's really nice, as you said. So now, like, if we look at our app.service, right, we've just got one line for observable. We go to our component, right? We do almost one line here. And actually, we could take this a step further. We could actually remove this entirely if we're getting really about this, because we've already assigned user service to our app component. So in here, I can just say user service.
Oh, man.
Users, right? And at this point, like, there's zero logic in this component. It's a one-liner. I think this is to me, like, this is where it gets really powerful, right? Like, this is almost no logic, almost no code. It's about wiring this thing to this thing and saying, Angular, hey, go render it for me.
So are we actually pushing our components to be as dumb as possible because they should not think about anything? Everything is happening in the services. You just bring in something and then push it to the templates. Is that?
I think that in general, the pattern that we've sort of come around to, and this comes from React land, I think the similar pattern very much exists in React, is that you really end up having two types of components, right? So you have smart components, components that talk to the outside world, components that have business logic, components that are doing specific things for specific things in your application, right? They're not super reusable, right? And you shouldn't generally try to make them too reusable. There's one thing, one component that does one job. And then the other side of that are these dumb components, right? Dumb components that just render data. That's all they do. They might emit events, right? But they don't have any sort of knowledge of the outside world, which makes them highly reusable, right? And that's a really nice thing. So you end up with really two types of components. You have smart ones, which sort of handle the outside world, and then dumb ones, which just do rendering, right?
Maybe we can think about the naming later, the dumb and the smart.
I think I've heard container, presentational. There's a bunch of different words, but from smart and dumb, it seems to be the best way.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I think we have actually, it's I think a good thing that we have done. We have gone all the way from stage 1, I think, to stage 2, and this is I would say the final stage where you can just clean up your component completely, right?
Yep.
Okay. So what else are we doing, Rob? What else can we do with observables and?
There's a few places that we expose them inside of Angular, right? And so the first thing to know is that in general, what I'm doing over here in my app.service here, this sort of new observable thing here, like this is the manual way of doing it, right? Like this is me manually creating an observable, just like you can manually create a promise. But like promises in most cases, right? You are not going to manually create them. Something you use, Angular or some third-party library or whatever, is going to hand you an observable, right? It's going to say, this is I already returned an observable. So in general, you won't have to do what I'm doing here. And so, what do you think? HTTP is probably the simplest thing to show.
Yeah, I think HTTP is a good thing to show. Yeah.
I think we have HTTP installed. So if we don't, and I'm going to do it just in case. So Angular's HTTP library is npm install Angular HTTP. That's pretty sure I have it. So we're going to import from Angular HTTP. In here, we want to get the HTTP service. And then again, in our module, let's go to app.module. We want to make sure we bring it in here. So we're going to bring in import the HTTP module from Angular HTTP. And so we're going to bring that module into our imports here. So this makes HTTP available to the whole application. And then I can come back to my service here. Get rid of our user's property here, and what we'll do is open up our constructor. Again, do private HTTP. So all I'm doing is injecting it here. And then actually, let's put our user's property back in there. This time, let's say observable of user any. We'll go ahead and create a user interface. We'll do it right? It's always better to do it right. User and a name of string. So again, we'll do exactly what we did, and I'm actually not going to change the code at all here. So I'm going to do, this dot users is HTTP dot get. HTTP.get. So let's imagine we have a users.json. We can create that.
I think we can, if you don't mind, we can use the JSON placeholder .ip code.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
One up here, JSON placeholder.
Yeah, and we can do a /users on this.
That does have a users API, does it? Yes, awesome. So we'll go ahead and stick this up here. So it's like our const users URL is that. Work, because you're going to make me use it, and it's going to blow up in my face, right? So http.get.users URL, and so this returns an observable, and this is going to complain because right now it's an observable of response. So response is the object wrapped around the data that comes back. And we're going to just sort of gloss over here. We're going to use the map operator. I think we're going to come back and cover this shortly here. We have this response object, and then all I really want to say is I want the JSON out of this object here. Right. And so again, http.get here returns an observable, and then we're going to map that, change that, transform that into a new observable as well. So if we go back to our component now, do we have name on that JSON type of code thing? I haven't.
Yeah, and they have it.
Name is there, groovy. I'm glad that I picked the right thing there. Let's go back to our components. That should be the same. That should be the same. User service there. Users. Save on that. Oh, big, huge error. Okay, so this is good because actually pretty much everybody who's worked with Angular 2 runs into this error at some point, right? So this is the map. It's not a function, but
yeah, we have an imported map, I think, right?
Exactly. That's right. So I'm going to go back over to my module, to my service, which is here. And what I'm actually going to do is just bring in import our XJS add operator map. And that should now hopefully, great.
Cool. We have it running.
Cool about this, right, is that we've done this other thing with a totally different API. We're using a totally different thing inside of Angular, right? But because it's an observable, right, we didn't have to change our component code at all. It stays exactly the same, which is really nice.
I have a question, Rob. If you can go back to the component.
To the component or the service?
I think it's service, to the service, yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So in here, I'm saying, okay, I make call, I get the results, and then I map it over, and then I fetch out the JSON from it, right? The user's observable that I have in my service is of type observable, which is of type users inside of it, right? How is it actually mapping? Is it actually checking the interface versus the...
So because this is dynamic data coming off of a server, right? This is where TypeScript can't help you effectively, right? Because it doesn't know what the real data looks like. So it's important to realize that TypeScript is not at runtime checking anything for you, right? It's purely a compile development time thing, right? And so really, if we're going to do this kind of full on, we're going to do this absolute property. And this is what you would do if you had your own API you were talking to, right? What you want to do is go and look at that data coming back from JSON placeholder, right? So it has a big object and it's got a bunch of different keys. And then you would go ahead in your own code, define the interface that had all those properties, right? So I don't know, like address is a bunch of other stuff. And that means then when you're actually using this thing, right? So if I like users.subscribe, then I can actually do, v dot, it knows it's an array, and I could say for each item on the array, and then that item would actually have
the name and not other properties.
Name property assigned, right? So it's at the boundary between, the outside world and your own application. That's where you really want to use these interfaces to say to TypeScript, this is the kind of data that's going to come back from this thing.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. If you can talk about unsubscription, like when is the time when you want to unsubscribe from a observable, or do we even have to, or does it take care of its own? Because from old school JavaScript, I still remember that we have to cancel all the subscription that we make in set timeout and others. So is it the same thing in observables, or? So
this is a good question, and this is something that's worth covering, I think. So we're going to step out of Angular for just a second, because I think it's easier to understand outside of Angular, right? So we're going to create a manual observable here. I'm going to import observable from RxJS, Rx, and then I'm going to do like let ticks is a new observable, and all I'm going to have this observable do, observer, because that's really annoying. So I'll just reload that. Yes, I do. Cool. All right, so what I'm gonna do is create a like a vanilla observable here, and then inside of it, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do a set interval, and I'm going to every 1,000 milliseconds tick an observer to the outside of the observer. That next, hello, and so if I then subscribe to this, so ticks.subscribe. What you would expect here, right, is that every second, right, we're going to emit the value hello to the outside world, and so we should see if we go look at our console that actually happening. Yep, so it's now hellos, and of course you need to stop this at some point, right? Like, you know, just let every interval in your application run forever, then that's not really ideal, right? And so,
unless you have unlimited memory in your browser,
right? Unless you're really not worried at all about how performant your application is, and you don't really care about your users, then great, don't worry about it, right? But in this case, you should, right? So the cool thing that observables do is they give us a little bit of extra functionality. So what I'm going to do is here is say const ID, and this is not observable here. This is just
this is
JavaScript, right? And this is just saying I'm keeping the ID of my interval that I have running. And then what you can do when you create an observable, again, so this is inside of my main function here, I can return a function from here. And this becomes my cleanup function, my tidying up function, right? So I can say, when I ask for cleanup, and I'll log this out so we can see it happening, cleaning up, we can then do, I'm going to clear interval of our ID, right? So that will stop this timer from repeatedly doing what it's doing. And so, again, nothing's going to change here because I'm not actually going to do any subscription. This is all totally normal stuff. Tick, 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 hello should come out. Yes, it does. And so when you call subscribe on an observable, what this returns to you is a subscription. So this is actually, we'll say this is the ticks subscription. And so this is very similar to our ID thing here. Like, this is just a reference to the active subscription, the active work that's happening, right? And then what I can say is, at some point later, I want to, I'm going to just put this in a set timeout for like, like I say, inside of my set timeout, so after 2 seconds, right, ticks subscription dot unsubscribe. And so what will happen is this will fire up, we'll get a couple of hellos emitted out, and then we'll get that cleanup function. And that will actually then call that cleanup function and then stop the work happening, right? And so go back to your original question, right? Like, why, when do I do this? Back. I cleared my buffer out. So go back to the app code itself, app.components. So the answer to like, when do I have to do that? When do I have to unsubscribe? Sort of, it depends is the answer to that question, right? So an HTTP request, like we're using with our user service here, right? User service dot subscribe. You never have to unsubscribe to this because it completes by itself, right? It emits one value and then it's done and it will clean itself up. So HTTP, you don't have to worry about unsubscribing. The other place that we expose this is in the router. And so if I were to bring in like import router at Angular/router, I'm not going to set this up, but if I were to just had this and injected it, right, router. So like in the router, for example, router.query, I think it's, sorry, if I brought in the activated routes, not the route. So this would tell you in Angular, like, this is the active route that I'm on. So the route itself has a couple of things. We get params. So this is params. This was, so user/ID, right? That would be a param. Those params are observable, and so those are delivered to you, right? And every time that the parameter changes, you will get a new notification that says, hey, this thing has changed. But you don't have to clean this up because Angular, again, is managing the router observables for you. So this is something that you don't have to worry about. You can just subscribe, and that's totally fine. The case where you do need to worry about subscribing is especially when you've created one yourself, right? Yeah. So that set interval one I created a little while ago, that would run forever. It never completes, right? So that's the kind of thing that you need to be conscious of tidying up. The other thing that's really nice is that the async pipe does that for you automatically. It automatically subscribes, and it also automatically unsubscribes, right? So at that point, Angular handles all that for you, and you don't really have to worry about it. So the main place you have to worry about unsubscribing is when you are creating them manually yourself, right?
Okay. So, okay, this brings me to a thing. Maybe I'm not sure if it's too much for within this show.
Sure.
Can we create a custom observable type and show and like try to unsubscribe it from it?
How do you mean?
Like maybe creating a custom type, maybe creating a class, which but then again, I'm not sure if that will make any sense. If you'll wrap it within.
That extended from observable, you mean?
Yeah, something like that, because that's where you'll be worrying about the unsubscription, right? Is that correct? I
would say in general, like you as a user, and I think that in all of my time of RXing and all of the RX code that I've ever written into Angular, I think I've only ever created one custom type of observable, right? Because the observable itself is it's a really dynamic thing, right? You can do whatever you want with it. And so it's more to me about like what that observable delivers necessarily. Right?
Okay.
And so yeah, I don't know that like it's I think I can show it to you. I actually have to remember how to do this, right? So if I do like class my custom.
Hey guys, this is a hardcore show, so we love challenging Rob, and he loves taking challenges. So yeah.
I think the way I do this, right? So yeah, got a T. And so the way that observables all wired together is it has a custom lift method. And I think lift brings in source. This may be the part that's wrong. And then inside of there, I can do like let's new observable. Oops. I think it's like new my custom observable, and then I set the new observable dot source to source, and I return the new observable. Oops. Observable. And so like this is something you'll probably never ever do. But this is what makes map, filter, reduce, etc. They all work with this basically. And so this is something you will probably never ever do, but there you go. Like you know how to do it now, right?
Okay, cool. And then I can just do my custom observable dot lift. It'll just give me a new observable. Is that correct?
You don't even have to lift. So lift actually comes from the super, like it comes from the observable itself. So that this is just my override basically.
Okay.
Like add a I don't know like log and then map, for example. So if I wanted to have a custom operator in here, it's not like a prod.
Yeah, this looks like RxJS6 maybe.
Right, like then this is what you could do, right? And I think that in general, you're almost certainly never going to do this. And I think as a piece of advice, if you find yourself doing this, right, it's worth considering like, am I maybe doing this wrong, right? Am I doing something? Because really every service you're going to create, right, can expose observables as properties. It can return observables with methods, right? So it's pretty rare you would ever create your own custom observable.
Okay. Cool. So I think this was the hard stuff. The easy stuff would be, how do we do error handling? Like, is it just like dot error like we used to do in promises, or something more?
So there's a couple of differences here, but it's conceptually quite similar, right? So with a promise, right? So this is a promise, new promise. All right, so this is promise, and then a promise you do dot then, and that then takes two things, right? So it's on
success and failure,
error, right? So this is how you handle them in promises. Observables almost exactly the same. So let O is going to do observable dot of 1, 2, 3. So this is just like doing promise dot resolve, similar kind of thing, right? And then O dot subscribe. Has 3, right? So this time we've got an on success, and we actually call this next an observable land, right? So like on the next value, and I'm just gonna do it like this. So like val console.log value.
Mhm.
It's got an error handler, right? So this would take an error and say like console.error, and then it takes a third one. This is where it differs a little bit, which is complete, and that's console.log, which is say complete. And so, not that. The reason you would do this, well, TypeScript doesn't like that very much, does it? What are you complaining about? Any void O, right?
Maybe can just give it a simple variable name?
Okay. It's an empty variable.
Oh.
So the point here is that, right, like if we think about our interval, right, that ran forever, you need to know when things are done, right? Promises only deliver you one value, so a promise is done at the same time it delivers you the value. Observables can deliver you many values, so you need to know when it's done, right? And so this third parameter here will tell you that. And so these are the three you always use. You know, it's I want to listen to the next value, I want to handle it if I have an error, and then I need to know when it's done. There are other cases, right? So certain things, like there's a really good case where if you had an HTTP request, and actually that's probably a more reasonable way to show it.
We already have one, right? So maybe if you can do something bad in there, can we do that?
Let's see if we can screw this up. Oh, we don't need that anymore. So if I go back to my app, where did I call that service? And let's just break the URL, right?
Yeah. Don't try this at home. That's like how to break your code.
And so this is something, this is actually, that's a, like, I don't know if you did this on purpose, but this is a really good thing, right? So you have this problem now where because Angular is doing the subscription for us automatically, right? Like we don't have access to subscribe. And so if we ran this, you get a big nasty error, right? There's nothing we can handle with this. There's nothing we can do, right? And so there's a few different ways to handle this. And I think that the way that we typically would recommend to you is up at the source of the observable. Go back to our service here. So we have, it's a little bit prettier, easier to read. We have in Rx, just like we do in promises, a catch operator. Catch operator. And so the catch operator lets us handle errors, recover from errors, right? So like, let's say that instead of me breaking the URL here, the server was temporarily down, right? And if it's temporarily down and we don't display the list of users, that may not be a big deal, but we don't want it to like fail our application, right? So what catch allows us to do is a couple of interesting things. The first thing is we can just return, I'm gonna return an empty observable here. Like this allows me to recover from the failure, right? It says, okay, instead of blowing up and spewing out an error, right, just like go ahead and recover from the error and emit an empty thing. Or I could do observable, I think it's dots, what do we call it? Never. So like it's just an empty observable, never emit a value, right? And what's cool about this is so like catch is the most utterly basic error handler in Rx. But one of the really interesting things I think that we don't talk about enough with observables is that we can subscribe to them repeatedly. So again, with a promise, right, you subscribe to it once, or you assign to it once, it does one work, and then that promise is basically done. It will never be able to do that work again. You have to create a new promise to do work again.
Right.
Observables aren't like that. Observables can be repeatedly resubscribed to, right? And so again, if we had this HTTP observable, we could subscribe to it from multiple places and make multiple requests. The other thing it allows us to do, though, is really clever things like, so instead of doing catch, I'm going to say retry 3. So this will automatically retry 3 times before actually emitting an error, right? This is really good if your API is really busy, or you can do stuff like retry when, and I'm not going to do this because it gets a bit more complicated, but this error and the original observable. So like, and then I could say, I'm too busy, wait 3 seconds before, subscribing to the observable. Again, at that point, I can just return the original observable. And so this gives you really, really powerful error handling, which is, you get really, really in depth with this. But in general, always handle them either in a catch block or at the end there in that, dot subscribe handler.
Okay. That makes sense. I was just thinking about the scenarios where I'll be using the retry, maybe retry something that's hitting server continuously, and trying to figure out if it's still working, it's still working, it's still working, and if it's not working, that's fine.
Yeah, totally. You need to poll your server, right? Figure out, hey, is this work done or whatever? Yeah, it's the perfect case for that.
And maybe the catch thing that you just showed, where you're we're actually returning an empty observable. That may be a case when, for example, let's say I want to make a HTTP call and try to bring in HTML and just preview it. Maybe if I have the correct URL, I'll just do, and I'll get the preview of the HTML. But if I have the wrong URL, then I'll just, maybe I can also return a specific message, right? That
sure. Yeah, you can return an error, and this allows you to basically do. You can recover, you can fail with a different error. A number of different things you can do inside of this catch block.
But you can still keep your application working, which is the awesome part.
Right. And I think in general, observables, so promises often fail silently, and I think that's one of the most challenging things for people who use promises for the first time is that they'll swallow errors, right? Yeah. Which is nice, I think, in some cases, but in general, like it's often very hard to debug when a promise, somewhere deep in your application stack fails and you don't know anything about it because you forgot to return it, or you forgot to, chain them together properly. Whereas in general, observables tend to be much more explodey, and that's on purpose, right? So that's very much so that it fails fast and you know about it, and it forces you to handle your errors. And I think that's a very conscientious decision on the part of the people who are designing the observable spec. Is that, this is a departure from promises, same functionality, right? But we want to, in this case, fail out, where necessary quickly. And give you very powerful tools to recover. Whereas, when a promise fails, you have no way to recover from it. So it makes sense there. But with observables, because you can recover, having some extra functionality is useful here.
A strange question I have. Maybe it might not make any sense. If it doesn't, do let me know. So in terms of smart components, right? We talked about smart and dumb component. So in terms of smart component, we're actually doing some of this stuff in the component itself. Where do you think do we do this error handling? What's the best place? It should be on the service level, or we can throw an error from here and catch it again in the component. What kind of considerations will you take in mind?
I think it depends on the type of error you expect to handle, right? So like if it's a 404, it's not going to do you any good, really, to handle that inside of the service, right? Because your application is not going to know about it. You should probably know when it's a 404. So you may want to handle the error at the point at which you subscribe to it, right? Like as close to the application UI as possible. But cases like, as I said, like server temporarily too busy, for example, right? Case where you're going to use retry, I think that makes sense to move it much closer to the source of the observable, right? And so it depends, sort of how you want to recover from the error. The other thing is that you can stack these things, right? So you could have, your kind of generic error handler that handles the really bad cases up at the top of your service, right? And then have a more specific one downstream. If it gets past that first level, then you could have more specific error handling. So like I could have catch and then do another catch here if something else, I wanted to check another condition after I've done something else. Right. So it's very flexible, and I think that I try to think always think as close to the source observable as possible, right? And it's like, if that explodes, where do I want to handle that, right? And it's just a question of the source, I think, usually for me. But in most cases, I think having a basic catch service is not a bad idea inside of your service, right? More specific ones closer to your component. Right.
Okay. I think in the end, if you'd like, maybe we can touch on because I have used observables, people have used observables, but when they look at things like subject, replace subject, they really get confused. Like, are they like special type of observables, or are they observables or something special? So maybe if you can touch on subject and replace subject, then we can talk about it and do something about it.
My main here and run through this a bit. So I'm just start again. So we'll just bring in the whole caboodle. Actually, we'll cheat and do it the easy way. We'll do import star.
I love the crash course that you do in main.ts.
Yeah,
I'm loving it.
So there's a few different things, right? So I'm gonna destructure these. These are actually, let's just do it the hard way. I'm being lazy, and I shouldn't be lazy because it's more confusing, right? So we'll do observable and subject. We'll start with these two, and then I'm gonna bring in So do we have an observer type? We do. That's what I wanted. So there are two kind of important types to understand, I think, when we're using Rx. And so the first one is like the observable, right? So this is let O is an observable, new observable. So when I subscribe to an observable, I can do the on next thing, right? On next, on error, on complete. But in general, the sort of the specified way to do this, and so your listeners know, either way is absolutely fine. This is a personal preference. But in general, the way that we describe this is you can actually do it this way. So next, error,
Instantly.
So we have basically two things here. We have the source of the observable, the thing that's spitting you out values, right? And you have the thing that you're listening to, the thing that the thing that is doing the listening.
Yep.
That's the observer, right?
Okay,
So something that can be observed is an observable, and the thing that is observing that thing is an observer, right?
Yeah.
And so you have observable, which is this, right? You have observer. And the way to think about this is this is like read only, right? Like you can't push values into an observable. Values come from the inside of the observable to the outside world, right? So HTTP requests, intervals, the router doing stuff, all that stuff is just delivering you values, right? And so the case that we run into a lot, and the case that you do actually want to pass values from the outside world, then we have a slightly special type of observable, right? So what we have is called I'm just going to do this sub, and that's a new subject. And so a subject, at its simplest, is just an observable, right? It has the exact same signature. We can subscribe to it. We can map it. We can do whatever we want with it, right? But it allows us to push values into it as well. So it's that next call, right? Or we can push errors into it, error, right? Or we can complete it. And so what it means is that a subject implements both observable and the observer type. So it's got sort of both sides, right? It can be a listener and it can be a pusher of something that's pushing values in, right? And so this is really useful when you want to sort of bridge the gap between something that's not observable, right, and something downstream that might be. So a good case for this is like if I had a button clicker in a, if I had a button, I'm just going to sketch this out. If I had a button, maybe I should just do this in the component. What do you think?
Yeah, maybe if you want to try that within the application.
It would make more sense to do it that way. So let's go back to that. Go back to our components. Bring in observable. I already got it. All right, observable and subjects. Cool. So in here, what I can actually do is, and I'm just going to div in here. Take our user list out, actually. So if I just have a regular div here, I'm going to, again, use the async pipe, like value async, and then we'll go in here and say value is a new subject. If I run this now, we'll see nothing effectively, right? It's my dev tools complaining, don't worry. So nothing's going to happen here, and we'll just, to make that a little bit clearer, we'll say whatever else. So hello, and then there's no content here, right? No values have been emitted from this observable. What we can do is, and just for the effect, we'll say like set timeout, and we'll wait a second before we do anything, and then we can say this.value.next, and then I can say hello Angular unplugged, right? Let's get the branding right in there for you. Right, nothing will happen, and then a second will go by, and then it will spit that value in there. So the nice thing is that everything sort of downstream, if you like, from the subjects is listening just like it's observable, right? So again, I could flat map, do whatever I want with this. And then upstream, I can push values into it, which means that if I had an Angular template like this, and I said button, this is a reasonable place to do something like this. If I say clicky, and I can go in here and I can say on click, do value.next, whatever, but there you go. I want to click the button, it'll change to whatever, right? And so it's always going to keep the last value in there. Now, so that's subject. I think subject is, it's a very useful thing. I think that in general, it's a little bit like the deferred of promises, right? So in Angular 1, if you're an Angular 1 developer, we always said to you, don't use q.defer everywhere. I think subject is something that people reach for quite a lot. And it's often better to again, try to think about, like, do I actually need to use a subject here? Is there a way that I can, make this into a proper observable? But they're quite useful.
Okay, so I think you just said something. Yeah, so you just said something that it will only keep the last value.
Yep.
So what if the observable has already produced maybe 5 values in the past, and I want to go over all these values from start to the end?
Yep. And so this is actually, I think, pretty interesting way to handle things, right? So I'm just going to demo this in a way that's going to make sense. Actually, sorry, go back to my main thing. This is easier to do it this way. So let's do this. And if I do a subject here, so if I create a, like let sub is a new subject, and then I push a value into it, right? And then I subscribe to it. DevTool is complaining, but in fact, like, nothing happens here, right? Just,
right.
Like, nothing is going to happen here. So console.log start. Just people don't believe me on this one, so we'll just see the status.
I believe you, my friend.
I know, but we gotta make it sure, right? So start, subscribe, but nothing comes out, and so this confuses people. This confused me a lot at first, right? And the point is that a subject and an observable, for that matter, have no memory, right? Like, they have no recollection of anything. If somebody's listening, they will tell, they'll tell that thing that's listening, here's a value that's come through. But by default, observable has no memory, because again, if they're emitting 1 million values, you don't have to try and like cache all of those values. So this can be confusing, right? And so there's a couple of other really useful things in RX. There's 2. So the first one is a replay subject, and the other is a behavior subject. And don't ask me about the name of the behavior subject, because I don't know.
I won't.
From like science back in the day, but I don't, right? So if I change this to a behavior subject, the first thing is that this is going to complain at me, because it's going to say, well, I don't have a value yet. So if I start a behavior subject allows us to give it an initial value, and that initial value, could be undefined. That's totally fine, right? But it's got memory, so it needs to be sort of initialized with some memory. At this point, I have started with hello, right? And I'm going to go and move this to the end. But we expect to see here, we should see start, right? We've created a new behavior subject with a value of hello. And so that's like, now when somebody subscribes to this subject, they will immediately get the value that's been persisted to it. And the next time somebody emits a value in, that person will get that as well. So what we should see here is start, and then hello, and then whatever. And hopefully this will work. I'm not going to look stupid on your show. So it does, it's start, and then hello, and then whatever, right? So this is basically, this gives us, if you like, you can think about this like a variable, right? So if an observable is like a function and it's giving you values when you call it, a subject is, and especially a behavior subject, is like a variable. It keeps track of a value for you.
So if I can maybe, so can you just copy paste line 11, 12, and 13 and paste it on 15 again? Maybe I want to create another subscription.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. After this, whatever.
So what do we expect to see this time? I think we should see start, and then we should see hello get logged once, and then we should get next, right? And that should actually log out whatever here. So we should see start, hello, whatever. And then when this person subscribes, they will have subscribed after this one, so then they should see whatever. So I think we should see start, hello, whatever, whatever.
So will I not see hello again?
You will see it here the first time, right? Because that's the initial value. But then when we hit this will replace the initial value, right? So we're setting the value of that variable to whatever in this case. And then if we run that, we should see exactly that. Start, hello, whatever. Hooray. Doing well. What we're doing, that's all good. So good question, right? This is a behavior subject. And then we have this other one, which is replay subject. And I think this one's really interesting. This is one that I think is I find cases where it's like it would be very useful. And there's a lot of cases when I was doing programming like much earlier that I wish I'd had this thing, right? So what we can do instead is create a replay subject. By default, we're not going to give this any parameters. We'll come back and do that in just a second here. But the replay subject has effectively an infinite memory unless you tell it otherwise, right? So we're not going to change that code. We're not going to get an initial value. So what we should see here is we're going to do console. This is harder to follow, I think. So console.log subscribe 1, and then log next one. So what's going to happen here is like this replay subject has no initial value, right? There's nothing to start with. So when somebody subscribes to this one, nothing's going to happen because no value has been given yet, right? No value exists. And then when we actually next a value into it, then we'll push that value in, and then we should see subscribe happen here and here. And let's just cross-check that does indeed happen. Yep, so we get our subscribe. Nothing happens. Then we call next, and then both the listeners get. But what's cool about this is that if I were to go in here and I would say sub.next whatever 2 and run this again, it's going to remember those values, right? So it's going to put each value back down the pipe. This is super useful when you want to replay actions, undo, redo. This is really easy, right? Because you just push in all the things and then remember all the things. You can use something we should mention here is that you can get carried away with this, right? They have by default infinite memory.
Yeah, so I was about to come to that. Yeah, how big is the memory?
It's infinite to your stack, right? So like we can put a limit on it, but your browser will eventually put a limit on it. And so what you can do is say like max values here, and so we'll just give you 2. So like only remember the last 2, right? And then we're to sub.next. Whatever 3 here. So I'm going to pull this top subscribe out just to keep things simple. So we're going to next 3 values into it here. This subject should only get the last 2 that are emitted. So we should see whatever 2, whatever 3 here.
There we go. Cool.
So those 3, replay subject, behavior subject, and subject themselves, are very useful sort of around the periphery, right? When you want to keep track of things or cache things or replay things, all that stuff is very, very useful. But in most cases in Angular, we will deliver you an observable itself rather than a subject.
Okay, cool. So I think we are also running out of time, so we probably want to stop here. There are a few things that I wanted to cover, but maybe that's for some other show, some other time maybe, like testing observables and doing all sorts of stuff. Maybe, Rob, if we can have some last words on cold and hot. Like, let's not go into too much detail, like the theoretic details, just if we can have something related to cold versus hot observables.
Yep. So this is something that if you read about RX, you see come up a lot. And I think that depending on the person who you talk to, this very definition can sort of vary, right? But I think that the most important thing to understand is that an observable sort of by default is cold. Observable itself is a cold thing, right? So that means that no work will happen until you ask it to. Until you subscribe to it, it's no work will happen. It's cold, effectively. Right? But in some cases, like you may want to start work off before you subscribe, right? Or you may want to kick something off ahead of time, or you might, in cases, want to have things kick off and then not have that work kick off again. RX gives us a number of ways to do this. I think that the way that we typically see people do, and this is a perfectly reasonable way of doing it. So again, like here, at no point has any work happened. Subscribing to that, work would happen. Subscribe, work would do something here. The thing you can do though is allow yourself to do things like this. So I can do here what the command for this is. Let's call this P for sake of argument. We can do O dot. There's a lot of them here. So we can do things like publish and publish behavior and publish last and publish replay. And if again you see those publish behavior, publish replay, these are those same behavior replay behaviors that we saw. The other one is was it connect? What was the one you wanted me to show? Was it publish and connect? I never remember what it is.
Connect and connect ref. If I'm not sure.
So this allows us to publish an observable and then go ahead and connect it, start it off, make it hot. The one you wanted me to show was ref count, I think.
Yeah.
So we'll do a hot observable here. There are a couple of useful operators. One of the ones that I was just mentioning here is ref count, I think. Do publish and then ref count. So publish makes hot, and then what ref count does is keeps track of how many people subscribe to it, right? So it says subscribe, 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 and then what it does is actually listens for unsubscriptions. So when all of the users who are listening to it have unsubscribed and they have all said, I'm not interested in this thing anymore, then it will go ahead and tear down the observable, do that cleanup work, right, that we talked about at the very beginning of this. And again, this is the kind of thing that I think that for 98% of people who are going to be using RX, it's unlikely that you'll ever encounter these operators. In general, like you'll be handed an observable. I think the one to sort of know about, and I think probably the best analogy in Angular is that Angular's HTTP observables are cold, right? They don't do any work. Angular's router observables are closer to hot, if you like, because the router is always routing. It's always emitting stuff, whether or not you're listening to it or not, right? And if you subscribe to the router later, right, you'll miss one of the values that the router has already emitted out, right? Like it's not going to remember values for you, which is another part of hot observables. But in general, like I think as long as you understand the semantics of what happens when you subscribe and what happens when you unsubscribe, in general, like the cold versus hot thing, I think is less useful than a lot of people think it is. And I think for a lot of people, it's more confusing, right? I don't think most people should worry too much about, is this hot or is it cold, right? Like understand what it's doing under the hood, right? Like when I subscribe to this HTTP observable, it's going to do some work. I understand how that works. I know what should happen when it happens. And I don't really care at that point. Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it lukewarm? Whatever.
Okay. Sounds great. I think we are at the end of the show. And I would like to take a promise from you, Rob. Yes, you're on screen. Great. So thank you so very much for sharing all of this, by the way.
Yeah. Totally.
And do you think will we ever be able to make another show where we can just do APIs, observable APIs in Angular too, like talking about forms, a bit about routers. That will be in connection with this one.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a good idea. I think that for most people, like in a lot of cases, we dive into this stuff sometimes, and people don't quite understand like, well, what the hell it is. So I think that having the first show being like, this is what observable is. This is what the places you see them. I think that we didn't even touch on really like the real power of these things, right? And to me, people ask me a lot like, what's the difference between observables and reactive programming, right? And to me, it's like observable is just the thing, right? And I think that reactive programming, as we describe it today, is much more about a style of programming, a way to think about programming, a way to think about your applications. And I think that's, I guess, a whole nother 10 shows probably,
Yeah.
I think your users should definitely, your listeners should like check out observables, right? And even outside of Angular too, right? Just play with them like I was doing in there. Start up a plunker, start up a JS fiddle, just mess with them a little bit, get a feel for how they work. And then I think a lot of Angular becomes very clear when you understand that it's all the basic things, right?
Okay, so one last question I'm throwing towards you is, did you like the format of our show? Do you want to say something to the Angular community in Pakistan and, any message for them?
I think this is like a really cool way to do a show, I think. I think that I talk a lot sometimes, right? And just watching my face talk is not always the most interesting thing, right? So I think talking in code, I think, is a good format to do this in. So yeah, I think I definitely do it again.
Great. I'm glad you liked it.
Like, just try it out, right? Like this is something that, and I should say, I say this at every conference, but I'll say it on this talk, right? Is that like, if you're an Angular 1 developer, especially, right, and you're watching this and going like, oh my God, what?
Yeah.
I was like that a year and a half ago, right? Like when the Angular team said to me, oh, this is what we're going to do, I told them it was a terrible idea and that I loved promises and I would never let go of promises and like, why would you do this to me? And now like here I am a year and a half later, right? Like the prince of observables, right? So I would say like try them out, just give them a play. And I think that for most people, like you'll have a week probably where you're like, this doesn't make any sense at all. Totally. And I had the exact same thing. It lasted a month for me. But when it clicks, I think that everybody who has this moment where it clicks goes, okay, and now it's the only way that I can think about programming, right? Like I can't do it the old way anymore. And so try it out. It's a scary thing. We get it's a scary thing. But I think that it's something that you get comfortable with very quickly. And then I think your entire development life gets so much better, so much easier. Everything gets nicer. So.
Thank you so very much, Rob, for giving us time today, and hopefully we'll connect again. For people who are watching, thank you so very much for watching this show. We'll be back with episode 3 next week. Thank you so very much, Rob. Have a good night.
Good to see you.